Welcome to DisabilOTuk UK. I'm Joy, and I'll be guiding you through today's chair yoga workout with an emphasis on activating the glutes. I need to give a big shout out to my Heart and Bones Yoga teacher training cohort for inspiring the ideas for the movement practice you'll see today. I'll link to their resources and info in the description if you want to check out some amazing teachers and amazing people doing great work with movement practices. When we're thinking about chair yoga and activating the glutes, it can seem like a really daunting task because our primary movement of the glutes, or when we think about that glute action, is hip extension, right? Where we come up into an upright position. When we're seated, obviously, our hips are in a flexed position. So how the heck do we work these glutes in a chair yoga class? Now, I want to start first with why. Why are you wanting to work the glutes? What's the point? And of course, you can always skip ahead to the main movement practice in the description below if you don't want to hear all this cool sciencey information about why and how we can work the glutes really effectively in a seated position. But you're gonna want to hear this info at least once. Let's think about the populations that typically access chair yoga. People that do chair yoga are often like me. They have an energy limiting condition. They'll maybe have a chronic illness. They may have difficulties with their mobility, but this means that these people are still standing and they may still be mobilizing with mobility aids or independently, but have a reduced amount of time that they can be in that standing upright position. For this class in particular, I'm really looking at those people who may stand to do brief periods of ambulation, maybe using their forearm crutches or a walking stick, or there may be people who use a wheelchair full time, but they might stand to do pivot transfers. So with some support, they may be able to stand for short periods of time to aid in a safe transfer. And if they have that muscle, that mind-muscle connection, if that pathway is still open to them, then strengthening the glutes can make that transfer more safe and more effective. So don't avoid standing entirely when you're doing a chair yoga class looking at the glutes or the hip extensors, because these populations, people like me, are still needing to activate our glutes. We just have to go about it in a slightly different way, which is what I'll show you here. Before we get into that, we're gonna need to geek out a little bit on some science, which I love, and talk about muscle length. Right now, my bicep is in a lengthened position. The muscle is long, it's loose, it's not contracting. Now, when I start to bend my elbow, that muscle gets shorter. If we think about our muscles as little fibers that connect to each other, and when it's lengthened, they're just holding on by their little itty bitty tips, right? And the muscle is nice and long. It's more effort for that muscle to contract, and it's not as powerful. So as you start to contract the muscle, it's not very powerful, but then there's somewhere in that midpoint where you get that aha, I've turned on the muscle moment, where all those little fibers are overlapping really, really nicely, and you get the most power from the movement. And then when the muscle gets to its shortest part, where it's most bulged, all the fibers are cramped up and there's nowhere else to go. There's no more power that those muscle fibers can produce. This is really important when we're talking about muscle groups like the glutes. We want to have strength and stability through that whole range. So we want to have strength when the muscle is at its nice lengthened position and the fibers are just kind of holding on to each other all the way through to that tightened position. But most of us, when we're working out or when you hear at the gym, you hear someone say, and squeeze the glute at the top, right? So you're squeezing to that most shortened position. And it's very rare that we're working the muscle through that full lengthened position. What's great, an opportunity with chair yoga, is that you can work the glutes in a more lengthened position, which will help with control in standing up and with walking. So that's what we'll get into. So let's talk about the glute muscle and length. So I'm gonna turn to the side. You see, my glutes are right here, right? That bum muscle, and it crosses the hip here. It works in extension, but when I'm flexed, the muscle is lengthened. Think about when you're at the park and there's a really low bench, or you have that one cozy armchair or couch that you sit in, and it's really hard to get up. Well, that's because when our knees are higher than our hips, our glutes are at a super lengthened position. Those muscle fibers can barely hold on, which means they can barely produce any force. So we've got to use other muscles to give us a little whoop up in order to get those muscle fibers a little bit more connected together so that they can start to contract and the glutes can do its work. What I recommend for myself and for other people with mobility issues is try to avoid being in chairs that place the hips much lower than your knees. So a chair like this, where the hips are slightly higher than the knees, or a perching stool, which would be like a bar stool height, will mean that your glute is less lengthened, so it's a little bit shorter, and those muscle fibers are in a natural resting position where when you want to turn on the muscle, whoop, they snap right on because there are more connections to bring the muscle into contraction. The other piece of this is thinking about not just contracting the glutes at the top of a movement, but contracting them throughout the entire movement to help bring that lift into the movement. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can bring our core muscles into that to make sure our pelvis is in a nice position to support our glutes. So let's talk about that a little bit right now before we get into the movement program. Now, oftentimes when we stick our chest forward, so we might stick our chest forward to get up, but when I pop my bum out, right, and my pelvis is shifted anteriorly or forward, right, my pelvis has rotated forward, look how much length there is in the glute muscle here. When the glutes are that lengthened, try and squeeze your bum together. Can you even get any activation? Those muscle fibers are like, ooh, we're trying, but they can't really activate because the muscle is in too much of a lengthened position. What we want to think about is activating an opposite muscle group, our rectus abdominis, our core muscles. They help posteriorly rotate the pelvis. Rectus abdominis off, rectus abdominis on. You can see just by activating some lower pelvic floor core muscles, that rectus abdominis, it pulls me into a more posterior position at the pelvis, which then shortens gluteus maximus so that those muscle fibers can connect more fully and then glutes can bam turn on, and working together the glutes and the abdominals can place the pelvis in a nice position to help you lift through that full range of motion. And we'll even get into some walking in this program. I know that's a lot of science, and we'll revisit that as we go through each movement and how we might cue to help people understand kind of this relationship. So all of my practices are focused on being accessible for disabled folks like myself. So you're going to have a variety of people in your classes with a variety of mind muscle activation pathways. I like to call them pathways because in some conditions, those pathways are cut off entirely. And in some conditions, you can reroute to new pathways. And so you just need to think about, is that pathway there and available? And we might experiment from time to time to see if that pathway is there, but don't try and force a new pathway if nothing's there. As I work through the progression, don't think as one thing being better than another thing. Everything we're doing will be to activate the glutes, and people are just going to be on a different part of the journey to activate that pathway. They may be at the beginning part of that journey where they're just building mind-muscle connection. They may be closer to their kind of functional outcome in the journey where they're working on really improving that power in their walk. Please always remember to create a class environment where people feel comfortable staying with your first offering and being okay with that while you might have other offerings for other people. I'm really trying to work around my language about progression, regression, because in chronic illness, we go through progression, regression all the time, back and forth, and it's a whole mind thing. And so we let's not do that to people. Let's think about it as the part we're on in the journey, we're building this pathway, maybe some inflammation blocked that pathway. Well, we got to repair it, rebuild it, and that's just where our journey is at on that day. Make your praise about showing up, being on the journey, listening to the body, building that connection, having patience with the self, and not, yay, you stood. You are where you are. How do we make what you can do and how you can move useful for you to do all those things you need to do, want to do, and love to do? Okay, we're gonna finally get into the nuts and bolts of this program. And what I'd like you to do is to start with a body scan. I usually do a body scan maybe more in easy seat, but what I'd like you to do is sit at the edge of your chair if that's available to you. Place your feet firmly into the ground, and they can be hip distance or pelvis distance apart, and that can be quite wide for you. It doesn't matter. Rest hands where they're comfortable. If it's safe for you to do so, gently close your eyes, or you can just stare ahead with a nice soft gaze. The reason we're going to do this body scan is really to start building that mind-muscle connection. That is always, always, always the first part to movement. But we've been moving for so long, we don't usually recognize the thought process behind it. But when that pathway is blocked, you have to start building that thought process again. Go ahead, gently close your eyes. And for this body scan, I'd like you to start at the top of your head and just feel the weight of your head over your neck. Feel if there's any tightness in your jaw, maybe work it out if you need to. Are your neck and shoulders relaxed? Maybe you nod your head yes. Turn your head no. Little roll of the shoulders, bringing the attention to the back of your body, squeezing the shoulder blades as your shoulders come back, opening and expanding them as they come forward. And then bring your attention to your hands where they rest on your thighs. Let them be light and easy. Now come back to your sit bones. Maybe shift your weight side to side, front and back, maybe little circles. And really feel the expanse of the pelvis, the sit bones, where they make contact with the chair. And just explore that space. Does it feel restricted? Does it feel loose? Is one side of the body giving you more information than the other? Can you settle onto those sit bones? And then bring your attention to your feet. Can you feel your feet planted on the floor? Toe to toe, heel to toe, big toe pressing in, small toe pressing in. Can you just feel that base of security? And then as you come back up into the hips, feel the relationship between pressing that foot firmly into the floor and your glutes, those bum muscles. Can you, just by simply pressing your foot into the floor and bringing focused attention to your glutes, can you feel a little bit of activation in the back of your legs? Play with that. What are you noticing in your body? For me, I'm noticing there's a mild delay between what I'm telling my legs to do and feeling the activation. I feel a little bit of a tremor from my spasticity, but not enough to go into a full episode. That's okay. So my messages are maybe a little distorted. Maybe yours are nice and clear. It's not a judgment. There's no right or wrong answer to this. Just notice what it is for you today before we get really deep into this practice. And remind yourself of that. My pathways are a little garbled today. So they may feel a little garbled throughout today's movement program. That's okay. All right, now bring your weight forward to your toes and see how that changes whether you can activate the glutes if your weight is over your toes. Maybe a little bit. Oh, nope, I cheated. Okay, and now bring your weight back over your heels. Maybe even lifting your toes up a little bit. How's that? Ooh, that feels a little wonky to me. And then come back to that midpoint where you're kind of even pressure through the whole foot, your shoulders over those glutes, over those hip bones, and really to do that pressing, gentle pressing. It's not a big movement, it's little. My new mantra, a little is a lot for our bodies. A little is a lot. Explore that space. All right. You can open your eyes, come out of that. So that's step one. If we can't bring that mind and that awareness to our glutes, we can't build a pathway. So let's start with that. Next, we're going to try a little bit more activation. Now, our glutes, when we're seated here on this chair, they're not in their fully lengthened position and they're not in their fully shortened position. So this is prime glute working position. Despite what they may say at the gym where you're just working that short range in hip extension, no friends, we are going to work the glute through its full length. All right, so how we do that? Squeeze the bum in and release. Okay? Squeeze, release. That's what it is. You're holding the cheeks together firmly with urgency. You get the picture I'm trying to build for you here? Squeeze and release. Squeeze and release. Now you can experiment one glute at a time. Squeeze, it's a little bit more difficult, right? And just notice what happens when you do the squeeze to your thigh bone, your femurs, right? Squeezing, whoop, they draw in, right? Nice, firm into that socket. We love it. And relax. So just get that squeeze, relax. Squeeze, relax. And what we want to focus on here, remember what we said about glute length. If we're sticking our chests far out, our glute is going to be way too lengthened to properly contract. If we're here in this position, oh, I get no activation, right? So think about, a couple ways to think about this is maybe relaxing the ribs, maybe shoulders over hips. And one that I've learned from my teacher training that I really like is imagine with your hand on your chest, there's a flashlight, right? And if we're really anteriorly rotated, that light is shining straight up to the ceiling. Relax until your light shines pretty much straight forward. And that will put you in a nice position for this glute work. Now, what I want to also mention is as we're contracting here, I hope you're still contracting, or take a break if you're tired, right? Is that this is a concentric contraction. Bam, turned on. But we also need strength. So concentric is strength as these sarcomeres, as these muscle fibers come together. Eccentric contraction is strength releasing the muscle fibers. We want both. We need both. This will come into play in our sit to stand. So strength going whoop and strength releasing nice and slow. The eccentric is where I'm the weakest. So I feel it go whoop, nice and smooth, and then to release. That is okay. That is where we're at today. So contract, release. Contract, release with control. So try and see how slowly can you contract the muscle together and how much can you slowly release it. Now, studies have shown that butt squeezes like this can be more effective, build more muscle strength, more mind-body connection than some of our traditional glute exercises like glute bridges. So I'm telling you, please believe me, when we want to strengthen the glute through its full length and really think about squeezing tightly and then letting go with nice and control. Nice and control. Okay. Now, you can also add a little abdominal scoop to this action. So what that would look like, especially if someone is really coming forward and they're not quite feeling it, just have them scoop a little bit in their pelvis and squeeze. So it's a scoop and squeeze, and then relax everything. So it's almost like the abs turn on a microsecond before the glutes turn on, and that again can help shift the pelvis. Now, we don't need to worry too much about people kind of like pulling their pelvis too far and getting into this position, because we're gonna always lean forward to get that power up into a standing position. So most of the time people are not activating the abdominals and the glutes enough to aid with standing. So it's okay to get a slight round in the back because there's a functional reason that we're trying to get this activation together into standing. So now I've just moved up to a new pathway, which is abs scoop with glutes. So now I'm training my muscles to work in unison. And then I'm training them glutes release nice and slow. Whoop, whoop. There's some tone, that's okay. And then abs release. So by playing at the edges of each of these movements, we get more information, and then we can come back to the middle and find our nice, lovely middle ground. So it's kind of like bumping against those boundaries, those edges, feeling it out, and then feeling that nice, cozy middle spot. Okay, we've got this sequence, right, where you may start from the glutes or from the abs, where we're doing isolated movements. So just looking at the glutes as much as we can, just maybe doing the abs as much as we can, then we're combining them. And then let's think about this sit to stand. So usually when we stand up, I'm gonna use my mobility aid here. And I do wanna say that if you teach classes where people use mobility aids, encourage them to use them as part of a practice. First, we need to normalize disability in fitness spaces. So movement practices, fitness looks different for everyone, wellness looks different for everyone. So let's like normalize that you can be well and use a mobility aid, but also there's no point in doing all these exercises disconnected from the mobility aid, because maybe I do 5 sit to stands in your yoga class, but I'm using my mobility aid the rest of the time. I need to know how to use these movements together to make them meaningful to me in everyday life. So take the opportunity. Now, if you have somebody who's participating in chair yoga, doesn't use a mobility aid, encourage them to use the wall, encourage them to use a chair in front of them if they need that little bit of extra stability. Okay, so here I go. I'm just gonna stand up and then squeeze my glutes at the top. Now, I've just only worked my glutes in the shortened position, and I'm relying on my arms, my quads, all these other muscle groups that are not the strongest hip extensors to do my hip extension for me. That's not what we want. So what we wanna do is activate the glutes from the beginning and do some hovers. So what this would look like for me, I've got my mobility aids here and my safety H, right? And I'm going to build on our first pattern. So scoop the abs, squeeze the glutes, hover, and lower back down with as much control as I can muster. So again, we're scooping, squeeze, hover, lower, nice and slow. So we might hover only an inch. Only an inch is not just only an inch, it's an extra inch of power and movement. So you're working on the different lengths of power in your gluteus maximus so that that muscle, the primary, most powerful hip extensor, is turned on doing its job all the time. And we're asking rectus femoris, not rectus femoris, rectus abdominis, our ab muscles, to kind of help us initiate the movement. It's like a little supporting role, but then glutes are like, hey, you're prime time, get on main show, it's your time to go. So we're going to do those hovers, and it is just as important to focus on control on the way down, because again, we're talking about strength over length. So, or strength over the length of the muscle. Both are important. We need strength and length together. Okay, so again, here I am, activating the glutes, coming back down. Abdominal scoop, glute squeeze, and I do shift my weight forward. That's totally normal. Hold and come down. Okay, so now what this does, and by using my mobility aid, you're actually also working the upper body. You're working that balance, because this is how I'm going to have to stand up every single day when I'm outside of your yoga class. It's not going to be a chair for anybody who uses a mobility aid. They're going to be using their crutches. They're going to be using their walking stick. So let's practice with the things people are going to be using every single day to scoop, squeeze, hover, and back down. Okay, so you notice, maybe you notice, my toes start to grasp the floor. So I've really pushed it on that hover. And that might be where I am practicing while you build new further pathways with other people in your class. And this whole sequence may be enough for someone's glutes. In fact, the very first mind to muscle connection maybe is where somebody progresses, or there's that word again, where somebody makes a pit stop on their journey for that day. And that is absolutely fine. So now we've brought the mind to the muscle. We've started to strengthen the muscle at various lengths, working on that concentric coming up action in our sit to stands, and the eccentric strength coming down with control. Okay, and we're doing that using the mobility aid. So what this looks like over time is, as someone builds strength at this lower hover and comes back down, then they can maybe activate a little bit more, okay? And then come back down with control. So you're building up to a full sit to stand where you're going to get to that more shortened muscle where you're scooping the abdominals, squeezing the glutes, and coming up. Here I am in a standing position. Okay, glutes are engaged. I feel that power in my glutes, and I felt them the whole way down. And then I'm going to practice keeping the glutes engaged, engaging my abdominals as I come down with control. And it's very hard to keep that mind to the muscle, but that's what the pathway that we're building, that we're engaging these muscles through that full length and shortening, okay? So again, we've scooped the abdominals, squeezed the glutes, and then coming forward, activate, still activating. There we go. If you heard my knees, that's just some crepitus, no big deal. Some knees are noisier than others. And then again, you're gonna lower down. Now, keeping that activation nice and slow with control. And I totally forgot what I was gonna say. I'll come back to it if it hops back into my head. So now you're standing up, down, you're doing those sit to stands. What I was going to say is that you're going to encourage them to play with how much weight you're putting into the mobility aid or the chair. So maybe you're putting a little bit of weight into the mobility aid, or maybe you're starting off putting a lot of weight into it to get up, wherever you feel that muscle activation. Over time, the idea would be, as you build that pathway, that less of your weight will come into the mobility aid and more of the weight will be on this like stronger base of support. But at least we're training the upper body work that's happening with the lower body work that we're doing, and making it really clear why doing this exercise or this movement sequence is beneficial. Okay, so now you've got some pro sit to standers, and they're ready to work on some walking. Now, you can do this standing next to a chair, or you can have them use their mobility aid. And I'm going to come into a staggered stance here. So think about this is our lovely walking stance. And one thing for trainers to know is you don't want people hanging over their mobility aids, right? So we want a nice upright position. We've got our feet staggered and you have some space between the feet. So kind of think about our foundations of yoga and our yoga poses where we're taking a staggered stance. You don't want to be walking a tightrope. And you're going to encourage them to shift their weight forward over the front leg while they turn on this glute here, okay? So say, okay, bring the activation into the glute. Oh, and I haven't done anything below the glute. I'm just saying, hello, glute, let's party, squeezing it, and you see my toes start to push into the floor, right? So when we think about walking, that's our power movement. That's our propulsion forward, is the ability of the glute to go whoop. And again, we see that femur come into the hip joint. We, have that connection with the toes pushing in. Now, I always encourage a slight bend to the knee, so we're not like hyper extending through our joints. So it's some nice joint health. So keep a slight bend into that knee. You're gonna turn the glute on to shift your weight over the front and really firmly press the ball of the back foot into the floor. So you're creating some opposing resistance here. So the glute is squeezing, locking that thigh bone in, and the ball of the foot is kind of pushing you forward. So we have some like pull in, push forward action happening here in this back leg. And then with control, we're gonna come back down. So it's shift forward, come back down. Now, I don't want my quads to take over the party. We're talking to the glutes. So if we notice that we're really kind of bending our knee into it, stop, reset, squeeze into the glute, and relax. Put a hand on the bum, squeeze, and relax, nice and slow. And then just come over and switch sides, whoop. Okay, so again, we're not walking the tightrope. We can have a hand on the chair, or it is, I think, always better to use your mobility aids in your yoga practice if you're using them regularly. And we're gonna get nice and set up. And again, I'm squeezing and getting that lift off, that push, and back down. Squeeze, and back down. Okay. Lovely, yeah. All right, so now we've gotten into that walking pattern and we're addressing that nice extension, right? So this is kind of a glute at its almost shortest range, not quite there yet, okay? And we have one last piece to this because we need enough power when we're walking to lift the leg slightly, right? Our toes need some space to clear as we swing our foot through. So at a certain point, we need glute to be nice and short to bring our toes off the ground, but then we need the strength as our glute lengthens and then lets hip flexors take over as we bring the foot forward. So how we're gonna work that? We are going to just take that staggered stance again, and step one, clear the toes. So it's that same thing where you're squeezing the glute, pushing forward through the toes, and then just doing a little lift. Okay? And it is okay to lean slightly into the mobility aids. That's what they're there for. Okay? No shame in that. So it's turn on the glute, push through the toes, and we've come up. And you want a slight bend in the knee because eventually your hip flexors are gonna come join the party, and the quads are gonna also be in this party. So as the leg comes forward to step, you now have the front of the leg working. So let's try that again. Bring the leg back. You're squeezing the glutes, pressing through the toes, and then you're gonna lean forward slightly, lift, bend, and place the heel. Okay? And then we can go to the other side. So I'll turn to make it easier for myself. So here I am, staggering. Left side is my weaker side. So I'm going to start by activating the glute, coming forward with that toe press. Okay, getting a sense of my balance and my feeling for the movement. And then I'm going to try lifting up. Balance is hard, that's all right. So try lifting up. Okay. And I'm gonna try and lift and extend through. And if I want to be extra, which I always want to be a little extra, I can drag the heel back to the toe, which will work my hamstrings, who also kind of help out in this party. Okay, so again, that is coming forward by activating the glute, pressing through the toes, and then lifting, and then bending, trying to get that leg to come forward, heel, and I'm just going to get those hamstrings in a little bit. Now, you can see the shakiness. I'm gonna sit here. You could see the shakiness in my leg, especially on my left side when I came forward, and I definitely felt it. But I didn't go into any sort of uncontrolled spasticity. So that little bit of shake, if it's not painful, is okay. But if you notice that as you're doing the movement, your leg kind of gets into that uncontrolled spastic movement, you've pushed it too far. You're trying to like burst through a barrier, and instead we want to like eke by it. So then that's okay. Reset, start over, nice and slow with the movement. Of course, this is a very functional sequence, specifically looking at how we can incorporate these movement ABCs, these movement practices into a yogic sequence that builds on walking. But think about how all these different pieces go into any of our yoga poses that maybe have a staggered stance, require glute activation. How can these poses, these postures be adapted in a chair sequence to make them more functional to ultimately result in like improved walking when we did some triangle pose or when we did high lunge, right? So what does that look like for chair yoga, and how can some of these like basics of movement for walking and our understanding of working the muscle through its full length, how might that impact creating a more sustainable yoga practice? That is a topic for an entirely different video, which if you'd like to see, please subscribe, drop any ideas for videos, any questions that you have, and I'm just so passionate about this and making sure that exercise movement is accessible to everyone. So please join the community, and thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
What did you just eat? Nothing.